to live in a world that is getting ever angrier. Social media, while having the great job of connecting us and making knowledge and information and communication more widespread than ever, has also seemed to bring out a lot of the anger that people fear to express face to face. It seems to have given courage, and what we can see is a very angry world. Sure, we live in a very challenging world, although that's probably not new to us. That's probably been true for every generation. Sure, it seems more so for us, but I've got a feeling that many generations felt the same. Nevertheless, previous generations aside, there's a lot of good reason to be angry, to be fearful. Anger especially at governments and banks and big institutions, that kind of thing has increased. But we also have our own personal angers, where other people have hurt us in some way, and we usually feel the need for some kind of revenge. So today I want to focus on the topic of anger and forgiveness, and perhaps where revenge fits in there. And later on I'll also try and squeeze in a little bit of what our friends, the Stoic philosophers, might have said. As ugly as it sometimes seems to be, anger is a legitimate emotion. People who've been hurt, or have been betrayed, or whatever it might be, do have a right to be angry. They do have a right to feel the emotions that they feel, resentfulness or feeling crushed or whatever it might be by anger. Those are legitimate emotions. And a lot of where that emotion comes from is the feeling of abuse that anger sometimes generates, and at bottom line, the feeling of being disrespected, that my own humanity is somehow not being recognized, or that I am in some way being seen as less than. A person who says something that makes us feel angry, they've often said something which illustrates a kind of a power dimension where they're demonstrating themselves to be better or more powerful or somehow higher in status. And in fact, when we look at the classical philosophers like Aristotle, he talks about it in that context where anger is essentially a form of a status issue, and it's a way of asserting your higher status than another person. Very interesting thought to think about, and very interesting just with that, to when you get angry, never mind feeling resentful, but when you get angry at someone else, to stop for a moment and be honest with yourself and think, am I trying to say I'm somehow better than that, or I'm somehow above that, or that they are somehow below me? The fact is that anger itself causes a lot of negative consequences for ourselves, not the least of which are the emotional consequences. As we know, the angry person is generally the one who is suffering the most. Whoever you're angry with is not likely to be suffering as much as you are. They might be oblivious to the fact that you're angry, or if they really do think that they're better than you, of higher status or whatever the case may be, then they might even be laughing. So the fact remains that those emotions themselves are toxic, and that they can even produce toxic results in our bodies. We have seen a lot of research that anger actually reduces the efficacy of the immune system. So on the one hand, it makes your own emotions toxic. On the second hand, it often affects our relationships in a negative fashion, and it includes negative effects on the body, such as cell damage, immune system damage, and of course the increase in coronary and other heart-related symptoms or outcomes. We know that anger can lead to a heart attack. That's an absolute fact. But it can also, without going all that way, it can still be putting a lot of pressure on the circulatory system. Higher blood pressure and all of those kind of things add to that. So the bottom line is that anger actually has a direct proven association with increased mortality. The more angry you are, it seems, the more you are likely to die sooner rather than later. We are not saying that anger is an illegitimate emotion. Remember, a lot of people have pointed out that anger is a very legitimate emotion, and as we shall see, there are even some theorists who suggest that we need anger. Sometimes, as I've said here on the show before, anger is something that can inspire passion. So it really depends on what we do with that anger and how we focus it in some way. Revenge is usually the way we want to focus. So the first step to dealing with anger is acknowledging that we have it, that we are feeling that way, and that we need to process it. And perhaps that revenge is probably not the best way to go about it. Certainly that self-righteousness or the sense of being wronged that so often comes with anger leads to the feeling that revenge, might free me from this anger. If I get back at them, or if the same happens to them, or something happens to them, then it will release me from my anger. So isn't perhaps revenge a legitimate emotional response? Well, certainly we must acknowledge the revenge fantasies. We're not going to suppress ourselves. But even though we might have great fantasies and it might give us a great sense of satisfaction, for the most part, revenge is likely to make you feel worse. Revenge and its associated activities are also associated with winding up your blood pressure and winding up your tension and your anger. Revenge tends to increase anger, not reduce anger. Actually, research has shown that people who seek vengeance and execute their vengeance often are angrier after that than people who never got a chance to do that, even if they did nothing else. Exacting revenge might give us a sense of satisfaction, but it hasn't removed the anger. It's easy to want to go down that path. It's easy to sit there and plan and obsess and all of that, and that increases our focus on what caused the problem in the first place. Revenge fantasies increase the problem because they increase our focus on whatever made us feel hurt. So more than anything else, revenge fantasies keep anger alive. The longer we experience the anger, the worse our immune system is, the worse our blood pressure is, the worse our emotional state is, and the longer that goes on, the more damaging and permanent that damage actually turns out to be. So we've got to monitor ourselves and make sure that we don't stay too long in the revenge fantasy or in the obsession about harming the person who harmed you, because you are becoming harmed further from their harm. It's like you can turn revenge around the other way and say, do you want them to get more harm on you by you sitting there plotting and planning and scheming? You're increasing the harm that they've done to you. You're giving them even more power than they had when they said that nasty thing or did that nasty thing to you. There are other emotional effects that research has demonstrated to us. Certainly, people who believe that revenge is the answer, personality tests of those people have shown that those people tend to be people who are negative about human beings in general. They often view people as generally bad in some way. They often carry feelings of anger, so they're often quicker to express anger in life. They seem like angry people or ratty people in some way, and they often are bitter. And because of, as we know how bitterness works, they bring a lot of that baggage into new connections and new relationships by taking a negative approach to people in general. And as we know, bitterness carries a lot of damage itself and is a very negative consequence of anger, because it poisons you and it poisons the future. That's what's so dangerous about it. It's worse than the anger itself, because it causes subsequent relationships, subsequent interactions with other human beings who've done nothing to you. It causes those to become damaged as well. So revenge and the building up of anger, the holding up of anger in any kind of way, causes bitterness, which is double damage to the damage that you've already done to yourself. Not the least of which is that people are often so wrapped up in the anger and the revenge that they're unable to enjoy anything else. They're unable to enjoy the present where nothing bad is happening. And so with that increased focus on that negativity, their lives tend to become more negative. Classic symptoms of angry people holding thoughts for revenge, probably not doing it much about it, include bitterness, but depression, anxiety, the feeling of lacking meaning or purpose, the feeling that you have maybe spiritual beliefs, but you're at odds with them. You might know about your higher side, but it's like you've fallen away from that. And mostly, poorer and poorer relationships with people, lack of connection or poorer connections or connections becoming fewer. All of these are the known consequences of vengefulness. On the other hand, the known consequences of forgiveness are pretty much the opposite of those. So forgiveness, unsurprisingly, is associated with people who tend to have better personal relationships, have better health, especially in the cardiovascular system, lower blood pressure. Then they tend to suffer less from anxiety and depression, less from addictions of any kind, smoking, alcohol, all of those kind of things, and generally have a better sense of well-being and a better sense of what is really spiritual fulfillment more than anything else. So they are more satisfied about life. The end result is more physical health and more emotional health, and probably a stronger immune system. Martha Nussbaum is an important modern philosopher who especially focuses on the matter of anger and forgiveness, and in fact recently published a book precisely on that topic, which she has written a lot and lectured a lot on that topic. She takes a slightly different and sometimes seen as controversial approach. Basically, she says anger consists of two main ideas. A grievous wrong has been committed, and the wrongdoer must now suffer. That's what creates our anger. And she says, of course, it's that desire for retribution, as we've been saying, where the problem comes from. And the desire for retribution is unjustifiable. Says Nussbaum, either it puts us into this irrational belief that taking a revenge on someone restores the offense that was damaged. And of course it doesn't. So that's one false belief. And the second false belief is that because the anger or that hurt directed at me has lowered my status, I can restore my status as a human being by retribution, by acting vengefully. And at best, says Nussbaum, if you are someone who's got a very strong desire to raise your status, perhaps you are overly concerned with status. Perhaps part of the problem is that you're excessively concerned with what she calls relative status. She says this is the error of narcissism. And narcissism is something itself which is negative and needs to be discouraged. So you need to be aware that if there's like this inner battle where the proof is I need to prove that I'm not worse than you, in fact I'm better than you, or there is this relative status, even if you're thinking I'm not as lowly as you thought, learning to acknowledge that in yourself is really beginning to understand I don't want to fall in the error of narcissism that says I need to restore my status. What is important, and which has been pointed out by other theorists in the field, that anger can have constructive functions as well, as long as there is an authentic harm that has actually happened. If there is clear evidence that the anger was directed and someone directly intended to inflict anger, Nussbaum says there are three constructive functions of anger. One of them, it is the signal to yourself from your emotional system, your limbic system, that a wrong has occurred and that you need to protect or defend yourself in some way. So it is an instinctive reaction that helps us understand a wrong has happened. Secondly, it can provide a motivation to do something about a wrong. So that's a drive and a motivator. Again, it's a little bit on the edge of the narcissism that Nussbaum herself has identified, but nevertheless, she goes on to say anger as a third positive effect might discourage people from doing further damage in the past because you're reacting by showing them that's harmful, that's not good. So anger as a deterrent to future harm from that person. And again, she says, what you really need to do is give a performance of anger rather than actually being angry. A very interesting thought. So she says, in order for anger to correctly convey you have done a wrong and that you should not do that again. Screaming and shouting, throwing your toys out and having a tantrum isn't going to do it. But a controlled performance of anger, as she calls it, can actually convey the impression this is not great, but there's no negative emotion extra has been raised and blood pressures and all of those kind of things, and perhaps that will convey the message. Sounds great. I'm not sure exactly how that works so well in practice. Sometimes a controlled performance of anger is a form of abuse itself. So again, we've just got to really watch the potential for narcissism in Nussbaum's solutions. She does have another angle on anger that she says great leaders like Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela showed, and that is about what she calls transition anger. So where anger is responded to rationally, which is very similar to, of course, what the Stoics would want us to do, is to take a rational approach to it. So she says the transitional anger is extricating yourself from the emotions and the preoccupation with yourself and with the past. So you've started by saying, okay, so this has already happened, the wrong has been done. So there's no point in going on and on about that. She says, so much anger is about something that's already happened. Transition anger, she says, is basically the response, something's happened, how terrible, how outrageous. Something needs to be done about that so that it doesn't happen again. So instead of taking revenge on whatever caused the anger, she says transition anger is to create a different future, to change what could happen or change the circumstances so that doesn't happen again, rather than having the violator suffer in some way. She says all that happens is makes us become a violator as well, and makes us become destructive. Rather than the desire for payback, we should say, let's look at the desire to change the future so that doesn't happen again. So she looks at how Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela did that in response to the wrongs that were done to them and their people in the past. Rather than taking revenge on the wrongdoers, we looked to how can we change the future. Nussbaum actually has some issues with forgiveness because she says that to a large extent forgiveness is transactional, where it's like, I will forgive you if you apologize. And she says that comes from religion, from primarily the Christian tradition, and it's a transactional form of forgiveness and therefore suffers the same flaw of anger. It makes you want the wrongdoer to suffer. So contrition, although contrition, feeling sorry, isn't a form of suffering, it's like self-abasing, it's lowering yourself. And remember the issue, anger is about status. So demanding that someone apologize is asking them to lower their status again, to be contrite and to self-abase. And she says all you've done is you've increased exactly the same problem that anger itself was all about. Well, I don't think that excludes all forgiveness, but it certainly does mean that forgiveness around demanding apologies might be a problematical way to deal with forgiveness. According to her, the solution to this is not to avoid forgiveness, but to give unconditional forgiveness and unconditional love in return. So unconditional forgiveness means no apology is required, no act of penance is required. You forgive out of your own free will, not because of anything you're getting back or anything in return or anything they do. So unconditional forgiveness. She does worry that unconditional forgiveness can lead a bit to moral superiority, and we do need to watch ourselves on that one. But ideally, if we add to that unconditional love, just respond to anger with love. Love drowns out anger. It sounds kind of new age, but it isn't about that. It's about the emotion in you. If you develop your ability to love, if you just continue to give unconditional love, no matter what, you are the one that benefits. So, unconditional forgiveness, unconditional love, a great place to start. Perhaps fundamentally, you need to find a common ground between you and your offender. That's what also makes unconditional love possible. If you understand that that person is no different than you. In other words, don't commit the same error of seeing the other person at a different status level as yourself. That was the error of anger in the first place. So we need to move on from that. We do need to forgive ourselves. So you need to accept that you're vulnerable, to forgive yourself for your feelings of anger or your thoughts of revenge or anything like that. And accepting and forgiving any mistakes that you might have made that led to their inappropriate angry response. Sometimes it's a good idea to put yourself in their shoes and think, why did they react that way? Why do they feel a need to defend their status as a human being? Those steps can really help you shift a lot of your pride. We need, in order to forgive, to move away from that sense of inner pride and my suffering and the sense of righteousness that comes from that. So what you need to do is let go of a lot of the ideas of who you should be and should have been and what should have happened, and start off by accepting the reality of where you actually are. It's often said that, staying in your suffering and understanding your suffering is where the learning happens and where meaning can arise. But then we must move on from that. So the steps to forgiveness involve identifying your own role as how similar you as a human being, but very importantly, starting from the point of view of unconditional love and unconditional forgiveness. The second thing is to focus on stopping the thoughts of revenge, understanding the problems that revenge causes and how it actually exacerbates the problem in any way. So working on the revenge thing. Thirdly, look at the point of view of the other person and see if you can see, how did they get to that act against me? Can I offer any kind of understanding, not necessarily directly to them, but that helps me let go of the anger. Let me identify my pride or my self-righteousness when I say to myself, I would never do that. And ask myself, would I? Is my desire for revenge any different than that? And that can help you let go and start forgiving without asking for apology. Then you need to decide that you're not going to perpetuate it, that you can deal with this hurt and move on from it, transform it and move it on from it, and you're not going to perpetuate it. It's a powerful thing when you discover you've got the power to stop pain. You've got the power to end the cycle of revenge, anger, and inequality, any of those kind of things, by not responding with revenge or further anger. It's a great power that you have. It's literally the power to create forgiveness and love. And when you realize that deciding to accept what's happened without bouncing back or passing it on, it can be tremendously empowering to understand that the power of forgiveness not only is about that, but it's a power to end a negative cycle for everybody, for the future. That's a great power to have. Finally, it's true forgiveness without condition. You don't have to accept and condone what they did, but you have to learn to forgive without requiring anything in return. Ultimately, we can remember what the Stoic philosopher Seneca said. He said, "Bestow pardon for many things, seek pardon for none." He really means hold yourself to a very high standard. Don't make excuses when you fail to meet it, but hold everyone else to their standards. Don't impose your standards on them. Don't make excuses for yourself with respect to them. Be tough on yourself. Be understanding on them. Forgiveness is better than revenge, for forgiveness is the sign of a gentle nature. Revenge is the sign of a savage nature. We will be back next week with a great interview with a great movie star, so check it out, be sure to be here, and I will see you Friday at